Welcome to this week's edition of Good Books Radio. I'm your host, Dr. W.F. Strong, and our book for today is called Faster, Higher, Stronger. Now, what in the world could that be about? This is a book about how sports science is creating a new generation of super athletes. And it's a book about what you can learn from super athletes, even if you're not one yourself. We're going to talk to Mark McClusky here in just a minute. If you liked the sports gene or you liked the first 20 minutes, you'll like this book, Faster, Higher, and Stronger. The myth of the lone athlete toiling away for years in pursuit of gold medals, that's a romantic and outdated notion. Today's reality is much more complicated and actually more impressive. Jesse Owens won the 100 meters at the 1936 Olympics on a cinder track with holes dug for starting blocks. He trained by studying the strides of racehorses. 72 years later, Usain Bolt won the same race in Beijing, setting a new world record that blew Owens out of the water. But in his training, Bolt used motion capture technology. He lifted weights, he took supplements, and more. So today it's impossible to separate the achievements of an athlete from the scientists who support him. There's a whole world of technology supporting these athletes. We're going to talk about that today with Mark McClusky. Before we get there, I want to thank our underwriter, audiobooks.com, where your first book is free. Go to audiobooks.com and you can get your first book downloaded for free. Try it out. It's a wonderful service. I love it. Okay, let's talk to Mark. My first question for you is that I have a daughter who's 4 months old. And supposing that I wanted to do everything possible to make her a super athlete, what would I need to be doing now to push her in that direction if that were my desire?
Well, now you need to be hanging out with her and having fun. I think we have this idea that parents can really intervene, as you say, like super young at 4 months old and turn their kids into super athletes. I don't think that's how it works. I think there are things we can do later in life, and I'll talk about some of those in a second, to help set them up for that sort of success. But yeah, at this age, just hang out and have fun. Later in life, I think the best thing parents can do is provide opportunities to their kids if along the sporting vector. I think one of the worst things parents can do is dictate to their kids what sport they're going to play when. We have the 10,000 hour rule, and sort of what's been floating around about that has really led to this idea of really early specialization. Like I have friends who've decided that their kindergarten boy is going to play baseball, and that's what he's going to play. And there are a couple of problems with that. One is it doesn't work. The background, of most elite athletes is that they play lots of different sports. They get a chance to see what they like. They get a chance to see what they're better or worse at. They find a match between their physical abilities and their personalities and the sport that they play.
Well, my problem with my boys, I give them lots of opportunity to play whatever they want, and they just play Call of Duty.
Well, there's that too. It raises an interesting question, right? Which is, where does the motivation come from? And it's really, really difficult. It's not impossible, and we hear the stories, but it's really difficult to externally motivate somebody to be a great athlete. It's really hard for you or me as a parent to be like, you will be a great athlete, and then make them do that. Most elite athletes show really high levels of internal motivation, that most of this comes from inside of them, that they set the goals, that they understand the sacrifices necessary.
Yeah, I interviewed Scott Jurek, the super marathoner, ultra marathoner. Do you know him? Scott Jurek? And he told me the same thing. At some point, he just decided that he loved running, and he found that he had some kind of internal gift for it, and he wanted to nurture that.
Yeah, and I think that's the case with most great athletes, is that there comes a point where, what you have to do is so hard that if it's not coming from a place inside you, it's really difficult to carry that through, I think.
If let me throw this hypothetical at you. If Babe Ruth were playing in Major League Baseball today, would he be Babe Ruth?
I think that if Babe Ruth were playing in Major League Baseball today, that he'd still be a great baseball player. I think what made Babe Ruth was how utterly otherworldly he was compared to everybody else he played with. I mean, things like he was hitting more home runs in a season than other teams were hitting over the course of a season. He was like this sort of like supernatural thing that came down from outer space that was like, whoa, like what is going on? What's interesting to see, though, is how quickly other athletes came to be, if not as good as him, at least in the same universe that he was in. And I think part of that is because he showed them the possibilities. We see this again and again in sports. In the book, I write about the 4-minute mile. They talked about the barrier, like the sound barrier. It couldn't be done. Like, who's going to break the barrier? And Roger Bannister did in 1954. And very quickly, lots of other runners ran 4-minute miles because they knew you could do it.
Well, Cunningham had probably done it, right? Except that he didn't do it officially. Probably,
yes. Yeah, I mean, that's the supposition from a lot of folks, is that he had. And so, John Landy, who was a great Australian miler, had tried and failed bunches of times, and then, several weeks later went out and broke Bannister's world record. It's like, oh, okay, this can be done. And so it's...
So you think a lot of it is just the mental block that says this can't be reached, and then the belief comes, and performance follows belief.
I mean, belief is such... we see that in so many things, right? Belief, from belief effects, like the placebo effect. Like, if you believe a drug is going to help you, it probably will, even if it's a sugar pill, because like the ability of our minds to control our bodies is pretty profound. And so, the power of belief is not to be underestimated, certainly.
So right now, the world record in the mile is around, what is it? 340
something. Yeah,
around 342, somewhere in there. I mean, but it's been blown out of the water in terms of world records from what they thought 50 years ago, right?
Right. It's anytime you predict, nobody's ever going to get better, like somebody almost always does. It doesn't stop us and me a little bit in this book from looking at those limits and what they may or may not be.
Well, we expect that someone will beat... Nobody has broken the 2-hour marathon yet, right?
Nobody's broken the 2-hour marathon, and we think of ourselves as being close to it because the marathon record's in 2:03 and change. But that's a big improvement. 3 minutes out of 2 hours is a huge percentage improvement at this level. And so do I think somebody will run a 2-hour marathon? I do. I think that given the current state of humanity and what we know about running, a lot of things are going to have to line up for it to be perfect. I mean, basically, to run a 2-hour marathon, you have to be an athlete with an exceptionally high VO2 max, which means you can process a lot of oxygen as you run. You have to be an exceptionally economical runner, so you have to use that energy really efficiently. And the environmental factors are going to have to be nearly perfect. The temperature is going to have to be right. The course is going to have to be flat. Probably Berlin is where a lot of these records have been set. There was one of the big physiology scientific journals did a thing around this a couple of years ago, like what would it take to run a 2-hour marathon? And you had eminent sports scientists from around the world all write in with everybody's got like little factors that they think is going to need to have to line up, 40, 50 factors, and they're all just going to have to sort of line up perfectly for that to happen. I still think we're probably 20 or 30 years at the minimum from seeing that happen.
Really? You think it's that far off?
I do, yes.
Well, just this week, we had the Kenyans won New York Marathon, and both the women's and the men's, and the women's and the men's, and they dominate. What's going on? Why are Kenyans so good?
It's one of the great questions in the sports world right now. Is what accounts for the dominance of Kenyan distance running? It seems like there are a few factors. Some of them are likely genetic, but not in terms of some gene that makes them just more efficient runners. They have a body type that's incredibly efficient for running. Mm-hmm. They're small. They have very thin calves, which turns out to be an advantage because it's less weight to swing.
Right.
And they Kenyans, have the advantages that they get from living at altitude. Most of the great Kenyan runners come from a single tribe in Kenya. That tribe lives at about 2,000 meters of altitude, roughly 6,000 feet.
Yeah.
That's important. You generate more red blood cells living at an altitude like that. They have a culture of running. They have a culture of running all the time, whether it be to school or competitively. So they get lots and lots of practice. That's particularly important when it comes to running economy, that you just learn to run more efficiently. They have a culture that rewards it. They're heroes. Making the NBA is not, or the NFL in the States is sort of an accomplishment.
Right.
In Kenya, that's winning the Olympic marathon. That's being a great distance runner. So I think everybody, again, looks for the one thing, like, they have this genetic thing, and it's not one thing. It's the accrual of all of these things. There was a time in the 20s where if we were having this conversation, we'd be talking about Finnish distance runners.
Uh-huh.
Finns dominated distance running for about 2 decades. And, why did they dominate distance running? Well, it looks like there were a couple of reasons, probably the foremost being they figured out some things about interval training very early on before a lot of other people and countries did. But I think it just goes to show that these things go in waves, that it's not like Kenyan runners have always dominated distance running, and they may not always dominate distance running. We don't know yet.
But right now they have a culture that celebrates it, so kids grow up wanting to be, that champion marathoner, as opposed to American kids who just want to, be the great wide receiver.
Right. You are. If you have the ability to be a great distance runner and live in Kenya, you are almost certainly going to get a chance to explore that ability to its furthest.
But there is a genetic inheritance that we can see, right? I mean, there's a lot of people in the NFL who are sons of former NFLers in all sports. Their kids inherit something.
Absolutely. I mean, so genetics are a huge part of this.
Mm-hmm.
We have genetic abilities, and we get uncomfortable talking about them sometimes. But you point out sort of these familial relationships.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there are hundreds and hundreds of second generation NFL players, and some third generation NFL players. Now the Matthews family is a third generation.
There's that many, hundreds?
Yeah, hundreds.
I didn't know. I didn't know there were so many.
Over the history of the NFL, I talk about this in the book. There are, it's astonishing the sort of generations that you have, and why you get that isn't necessarily like there's a football gene, right? I mean, that's a little bit ridiculous. But you have big men,
mm-hmm.
and as a big man, I am more likely to have a child who is a big man.
True.
Or will grow up to be a big man. I'm also bringing that child into a world where he can be exposed to what it takes to be a professional football player, to some of the culture around that, to access to coaching and understanding at a young age. You know, like I'm Peyton Manning, right? Like my father's Archie Manning. It's not just that my father was a great quarterback, but it's like I'm going to get to be around other great quarterbacks. I'm going to get to be around coaches who coached other great quarterbacks. I'm going to have access to information that some random kid doesn't get. Yeah, it's important.
So you're born with the genetics, and then those genetics are nurtured by the culture.
Exactly.
So what else is important? Now, you in the book you talk about all the advances in nutrition.
And nutrition is an area I think that might best demonstrate another theme that runs through the book, which is our individuality. Like when we talk about genetics, you and I could go on the same training program and have very different results.
Yes.
And that's because of our genetics. That's because of something in our body responds to one stimulus and not the other. Same thing holds with nutrition. When you read the popular literature about nutrition, it's all about like, here's the diet for everyone, right? Here's the hot new diet that's going to work for everybody, and there's no such thing. There's nothing. I would argue that there's probably nothing in the. There might be a few things in the universe, but there are very, very few things in the universe that work for every single individual in the universe. So the real frontier of nutrition right now is personalized nutrition, is doing, at the U.S. Olympic Training Center, they do a lot of blood testing with the athletes to see what's happening with their nutrition, to see the effects of different foods on their bodies. Are they deficient in some nutrients? A lot of indoor athletes end up vitamin D deficient because we generate vitamin D by being outside. Right. And if I'm a gymnast or a basketball player, I'm inside a lot. And so a lot of those athletes will end up supplementing their vitamin D to make sure those levels are where they need to be. So that personalized view of your nutrition, there are actually companies bringing that to people like you and me, and I write about some of those in the book. It's pretty fun stuff. I think
back when I was playing basketball in high school, they used to give us salt pills, and now they consider salt pills. Well, too much salt's a bad thing, but they used to give us these big old 500 milligram tabs of salt.
Right.
I guess it was kind of the early Gatorade or something.
But, yeah, it was an early understanding that you can have sort of a sodium imbalance that can affect some things that affect performance, but yeah, it's also sort of an overreaction to some of it. Certainly,
it's a mighty big hammer.
It's a big hammer and not the world's biggest nail. Yeah.
Well, so but what do we know today that? Like one of the things that you say is, you suggest is we can learn something from these super athletes. So what can I, a professional couch potato, learn from these athletes that would help me day to day?
I think we can learn a couple of things that help way outside of athletic contexts. I think maybe the favorite thing that anybody said to me in the course of the reporting of the book was something that one of the researchers at UK Sport said to me. And he was quoting somebody at Shell, the oil company. And this executive at Shell was in charge of scenario planning. He was in charge of spinning out scenarios that could happen in the future so that the company could think about them before they happened. And his line about that was that the only sustainable competitive advantage is to learn faster than your opposition. And I think that's really true. Yeah, I think it's true for almost all of us in almost everything we do, right? That in the sports context, today's crazy fringe achievement is tomorrow's baseline. And I think that's true in a lot of places. And so really what you can do is learn faster and adapt more quickly to those changes and continue to push yourself to try new things. I live in Oakland, and people talk about Billy Beane and Moneyball a lot here. And what the A's were able to do was not come up with ideas about baseball that didn't exist, because people like Bill James had been writing about them for a couple of decades. What he was able to do faster than anybody else was orient the organization around those ideas. He was able to learn faster organizationally. he was able to adapt those ideas and make sure that they were operating around them. And I think that that's a really powerful notion, that improvement really comes from that constant learning and that constant challenging of assumptions and that constant evaluation. Could we be doing this better? Like, if we were to start over, how would we tackle this problem? And I just love that mindset that sort of, I think, is expressed maybe to one of its furthest degrees in elite sports, but applies to all of us, I think.
You have a chapter here where you talk about the fast track. But wait, before I get to that, I want to ask you about: are most athletes these days, these super athletes, are they leaning toward vegetarianism?
No. In a word, no. It's especially. I mean, you just need protein, and you can get there through vegetarian means, but it's really difficult. But for the sort of muscular exertion and the rebuilding of muscles that you need, it's there are certainly vegetarian athletes, but I would say that most athletes certainly are not leaning towards vegetarianism.
Now, you have a chapter called "The Fast Track to Greatness." Talk about that. What's the fast track?
This is a chapter where I look at sort of an interesting notion in recent times, which is this notion of talent transfer in elite sports. And there's been so much said and written about the so-called 10,000 hours rule, this idea that through 10,000 hours of deliberate practice I can become an expert at anything, and without it I can't be an expert.
Made famous by Malcolm Gladwell in Outliers.
Made famous by Malcolm Gladwell in Outliers. It comes from the research of a Florida State psychology professor named Anders Ericsson, who studied musicians and found that in general the most accomplished musicians had practiced more than lesser accomplished musicians, which makes sense to us all. When you take that notion of 10,000 hours being sort of necessary and sufficient for elite performance, it doesn't hold up in the sports world. There are plenty of athletes who win Olympic gold medals with crazily less than 10,000 hours of practice in their field. 3,000 or 4,000 hours isn't unheard of. And so in this chapter, I look at how some organizations are trying to take that information and make it actionable. Helen Glover was a field hockey player in the UK, and she was a good field hockey player, but didn't make it to the international level. She made it to sort of like the sort of state level it would be in the U.S. In 2009, UK Sport, which is one of the sports science organizations there, ran a program that they called Sporting Giants, and they basically said, hey, if you're a tall athlete, for the women I believe was over 5'9", who has competed at sort of the county level, we'd like to talk to you. Because they were looking for rowers, and one thing that really helps in rowing is being tall, because you have sort of a longer lever. It's just physics. You can sort of move the oar further. So she went in and she did an interview and did some physiological testing. Her physiology was very good, and she started training. And 3 years after she sat in a rowing shell for the first time, she won an Olympic gold medal in London.
Wow!
It's this notion of using science to match up athletes with sports that they might be more effective at than the sport they're currently playing, and that's you can really fast track people to the literally to the top step of the Olympic podium that way.
So see, we go back to what we began with. You said we have a tendency to push children toward certain sports. I mean, I do it. I'll look at my son and say, "You're a basketball player. You're built like a basketball player." And the other one, "You're built like a linebacker. You should play football." And
right.
We tend to type people into sports that they're more likely to be good at. And you're saying that it's becoming more and more of a science to nudge them in that direction.
And you know what? Like if your one son is tall, maybe basketball is a good match for him. It's
But he likes soccer.
and if he likes soccer, he's more likely to play it and more likely to work hard at it and more likely to enjoy himself. The truth is,
fun is more important.
Because statistically, right? Statistically, it's impossible to make it to the NBA. Like, obviously people do, but like it's, you know, on the order of like 0.001% of men in the United States play in the National Basketball Association, right? And if you're not over 6'6", it's like even more impossible. And so this idea that we have of like, oh, I'm going to give my kid every chance to play sports and to be elite, like that's great, and the sort of the aspiration of toward greatness is I think really admirable, but I think you need to balance it with a little realism and a little bit of like
yes.
The most important thing really for most kids and for most of us is to enjoy the physical activity and to be physically active.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, I agree with you totally. Just Scott Jurek, I remember asking him about that, about training great runners. He said, "Don't worry about making a great runner. Just let them have fun. You know, let them run because they love to run, and the other will come if it's in them." So,
absolutely.
So I think that is excellent advice from someone who's a world class runner. And again, I remember asking him because he runs 100-mile marathons. Just crazy. Mm-hmm. And we go back to the belief thing. I said, how is it humanly possible to run 100 miles? And he said, you just believe you can. You believe you can, and you can. So I don't think I have enough belief in me to make that possible for me at my age. But maybe when I was younger, if I had his mindset, then yeah, I might have been surprised at what I could have achieved.
Totally.
Are you a runner?
I am more of a cyclist than a runner.
Uh-huh.
So, yeah.
And what have you learned from writing your book that's become useful in your life?
Lots of things. I think the idea of looking for those small gains and not for sort of magic bullets has been a big thing for me. And I think just really we've talked about data, but just collecting data and really looking at my training logs and am I getting better, and if not, why not? And should I be trying different sorts of rides or different sorts of interval training to what is the goal I'm trying to meet, and am I making progress toward that goal?
Yeah, what is your goal?
My goals right now are not competitive. My goals right now are just being in better shape, and so like step one is like getting out to ride more often. Which the irony of spending a couple of years researching and writing a book about sports is I'm in some of the worst shape of my life because I've been so heads down working on it.
So your work has pushed you away from your goal, even though you're writing about people who achieve these great goals.
Exactly.
But now that you're done and you finish all your countrywide tour, you might say, then now you can get back to doing what you love.
That's the hope.
Well, listen, thanks a lot for joining us on Good Books Radio. I love the book. It's quite inspirational, and I think it's a great read, especially for anybody, but I think it's really good for people who are teenagers and young adults who are still pursuing a kind of excellence in sports. I think it's a real good read for that. So,
excellent. Well, I appreciate it.
So thanks, and good luck on your tour. Well, that was fascinating. I enjoyed talking to him. He knows a great deal about how to become a great athlete. If you would like to know more, you can pick up his book, Faster, Higher, Stronger, How Sports Science is Creating a New Generation of Super Athletes. His name again, Mark McClusky. You can get it at all the usual places, download at Amazon, etc. Order the hardback. Great book, good read. Lots of fine pictures, too. Okay. For Good Books Radio and for audiobooks.com, I'm Dr. W.F. Strong. Here's hoping that all your books will be good reads.